Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. The Desert Rose Motel sits on a stretch of highway where the asphalt shimmers like water and the heat makes everything look like a mirage. Most guests check in looking human and leave the same way. But some arrive with eyes that reflect light like an animal's, and when they sign the register, their handwriting changes halfway through their name. My name is Jake Begay, and I've been the night clerk here for 3 months now. 3 months too long, if I'm being honest. But when you're 23 with a criminal justice degree that's worth about as much as the tumbleweeds rolling past the parking lot, you take what you can get, especially when you're trying to stay close to home, Window Rock, Arizona, where my grandmother lives and my roots run deeper than the red clay beneath this desert floor. The motel sits exactly 47 miles east of Gallup, New Mexico, on Highway 264. It's the kind of place where truckers grab a few hours of sleep between Albuquerque and Flagstaff, where families on vacation stop when their kids start screaming in the back seat, and where people who don't want to be found can disappear for a while. The adobe walls are painted the color of dried blood, though the sign out front claims it's sunset orange. 23 rooms, a lobby that smells like burnt coffee and old cigarettes, and a vending machine that takes your quarters but only gives you Coke about half the time. I ended up here because my cousin Tommy knew the previous night clerk. Guy named David Yazzie. Quiet type. Always wore his hair in a traditional bun and kept sage burning behind the front desk. He'd worked here for 2 years before he just stopped showing up one morning. Left his truck in the parking lot, with the keys still dangling from the ignition and his wallet on the passenger seat. His grandmother filed a missing person report, but the Navajo Nation police and the county sheriff both said there wasn't much they could do. People disappear out here sometimes. The desert's big, and it keeps its secrets. Tommy called me the day after David vanished. Jake, there's a job opening at that motel on 264. Pays decent, and they need someone who can work nights. You interested? I was living in my grandmother's house then, sleeping on her couch and applying for jobs that either didn't exist or didn't want someone whose only real experience was a summer internship with tribal law enforcement. Bills were piling up, and I could see the worry in my grandmother's eyes every time she looked at the stack of unopened envelopes on her kitchen table. What happened to the guy who was there before? I asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He moved on, I guess. You know how it is. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why they were so eager to hire someone immediately, why the pay was better than anything else available. Why the owner, a nervous Anglo man named Jim Forrester, barely looked me in the eye during what he called an interview but felt more like a desperate plea. But I needed the money, and night shifts meant I could take classes at UNM Gallup during the day. Simple math. Now, 3 months later, I understand why David Yazzie left everything behind and walked into the desert. Some nights, when the wind howls through the parking lot and shapes move between the Joshua trees, I think about following his footsteps. The night I found David's notebook, everything changed. It was my 4th week on the job, and I'd gotten comfortable with the routine. Check in the occasional late arrival, answer the phone when someone called asking about rates, and spend the rest of my shift studying for my criminal procedure exam. The motel was quiet most nights. A few truckers, maybe a family or two passing through. Normal people doing normal things. I was restocking the coffee station when I noticed the bottom drawer of the front desk was stuck. The wooden drawer had warped from years of desert heat, and when I finally yanked it open, David's notebook tumbled out, along with a handful of pens and some old receipts. The notebook was one of those black composition books we'd used in high school, its cover worn smooth from handling. David's name was written on the front in neat block letters, and underneath it, night shift protocols. Keep safe. My hands shook as I opened it. David's handwriting filled every page. Dense paragraphs mixed with numbered lists and sketches that made my stomach clench. The first entry was dated 2 years ago, just a few days after he'd started working here. First night went okay. Mr. Forrester left me a note about special guests, but didn't explain what that meant. Found out around 2 a.m. when someone knocked on the office door. Woman in a floral dress said she needed a room. Something felt wrong about her voice. Too many sounds happening at once, like multiple people talking in harmony. I gave her room 12, and she paid cash. Exact change. When I looked at the bills later, they were all printed the same year she was born. 1962. She couldn't have been older than 30. I flipped through more pages, my coffee growing cold as I read. David had documented everything. Strange guests who paid with coins that felt too heavy, visitors who cast shadows that moved independently, people who registered under names that changed when you looked away from the ledger. But it was the list on page 15 that made me understand why David had walked into the desert. Rules for night clerk: follow or join the missing. Never look directly at guests who arrive between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Use your peripheral vision only. If someone requests room 7, give them room 19 instead. Tell them the water pressure is better. Do not explain further. Keep sage burning behind the desk at all times. The smoke helps them recognize you as neutral. When guests sign the register and their handwriting changes mid-signature, accept it. Do not ask questions. If you hear children laughing in the parking lot after midnight, do not investigate. There are no children staying at the motel. Room 23 stays empty. If someone insists on that room specifically, call Mr. Forrester immediately. He will handle it. Trust the dogs. If stray dogs gather in the parking lot and refuse to leave, something dangerous is coming. Never serve coffee to guests who don't cast reflections in the pot's surface. The list continued for 3 more pages, each rule more specific than the last. David had added notes in the margins, observations about which guests triggered which rules, patterns he'd noticed over 2 years of night shifts. Guest in room 15 hasn't left his room in 4 days. Housekeeping says the room is empty when they knock, but I see his truck in the parking lot every night. Red Ford with New Mexico plates ending in 847. Asked Mr. Forrester about it. He told me to mind my own business and keep the sage burning. I closed the notebook and stared across the lobby. The vending machine hummed in the corner, its fluorescent display casting blue light across the faded carpet. Everything looked ordinary, peaceful even. But now I noticed things I'd ignored before. The way the security camera above the door pointed toward the parking lot, but never actually recorded anything. The fact that the ice machine's electrical cord disappeared into the wall, but there was no outlet. The smell of sage that I'd assumed came from the desert wind, but was actually stronger inside than out. My phone buzzed. Text from Tommy. "How's the job going? You settling in okay?" I started typing. It's fine. Just boring night shift stuff. But my fingers hovered over the send button. What would I tell him? That I'd found a notebook full of rules about supernatural guests. That the previous clerk had documented 2 years of encounters with things that shouldn't exist. A car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the office windows. I shoved David's notebook into the drawer and slammed it shut. The digital clock on the desk read 2:17 a.m. Through the window, I watched a woman in a floral dress step out of an old sedan. She moved with purpose, her shadow stretching long across the asphalt. As she approached the office door, I remembered rule number 1 and turned my head slightly, watching her approach in my peripheral vision. She knocked 3 times, each knock echoing like it came from inside a well. "We're open," I called out, keeping my eyes fixed on the computer screen. The door chimed as she entered. I could see her shape in my peripheral vision, tall and thin, but something about her outline seemed to shift and blur. "I need a room," she said, and her voice was exactly as David had described, multiple sounds layering together, like a radio picking up several stations at once. "Of course." I pulled out the registration book, my hands steady despite the way my heart hammered against my ribs. "How many nights?" "Just tonight." She approached the desk, and I caught a glimpse of her dress. Floral pattern, exactly like David had written about. Could be coincidence. Could be the same woman, returning after 2 years. She signed the register with a pen that appeared in her hand from nowhere. I kept my eyes on the page as her signature flowed across the line. Martha Williams became Martha Willhunter, became something with too many consonants to pronounce. "Room 19, I said, handing her the key. "Excellent water pressure." She paused, and I felt her attention focus on me, like heat from an open oven. "Thank you," she said, and for just a moment her voice sounded perfectly normal. Human. The door chimed again as she laughed. I waited until her car door slammed before I looked up, just in time to see her taillights disappear around the corner of the building. I pulled David's notebook back out and turned to a fresh page. My hands shook as I started writing. Week 4, night 26. She came back. The woman in the floral dress checked out at exactly 4 a.m., sliding her key through the slot in the office door without a word. I didn't see her leave, but when I looked outside at dawn, her car was gone and room 19's door hung open, swaying in the morning breeze. I should have called in sick for my next shift, should have driven to my grandmother's house, helped her with her garden, and pretended David's notebook was just the rambling of someone who'd spent too many lonely nights in the desert. Instead, I showed up at 11 p.m. with a thermos of coffee and a bundle of sage my grandmother had given me for cleansing negative energy. "You look tired, grandson," she'd said when I'd stopped by that afternoon. "This job is taking something from you." She was right, but I couldn't explain what it was taking. How do you tell your grandmother that you've inherited a position watching over creatures that wear human faces like masks? Mr. Forrester was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, pacing between the coffee station and the front desk. He was a small man with nervous hands and hair that had gone gray too early, the kind of person who looked like he'd been apologizing his whole life. "Jake, good, you're here." He gestured toward the registration book. "We need to talk about procedures, protocols. David left some notes. I assume you found them." "The notebook," I said. "Yeah, I found it." Good. He wiped his palms on his jeans. "Look, I know it seems strange, the rules and all, but this motel has been in my family for 30 years. My father built it, and his father helped choose the location. There are arrangements, agreements, old ones." "Agreements with who?" Forrester's laugh came out like a cough. "Doesn't matter? What matters is keeping everyone safe. The guests, the staff, the community. These things, they need a place to rest during their travels. Better here, where we can monitor them, than scattered across the reservation causing real problems." I thought about the missing person reports I'd processed during my internship. People who vanished hiking in the desert. Families who disappeared between gas stations. Truckers whose rigs were found empty on remote highways. What happened to David? David broke rule number 12. Forrester's voice dropped to a whisper. Never follow them into the desert, no matter what they show you, no matter what they promise. David saw something in the parking lot one night. Something that looked like his dead brother, and he followed it out into the sand. We found his truck the next morning, but David... He shrugged. The desert keeps what it takes. Before I could ask about rule number 12, which I hadn't seen in the notebook, Forrester grabbed his keys from the desk. I'll be at home if you need anything. But Jake? Don't need anything. Follow the rules, mind your business, and everyone goes home safe. He left me alone with the notebook and the growing certainty that I'd stepped into something far larger than a simple night clerk position. The first guest arrived at 11:47 p.m. A trucker, normal as they come, who paid for his room with a credit card and complained about the price of diesel fuel. He took room 8 without incident, and I relaxed slightly. Maybe tonight would be ordinary. But then the stray dogs showed up. They came padding out of the desert like gray ghosts, 3 of them moving in a loose pack. German shepherd mix, maybe some coyote blood, all of them thin and alert. They positioned themselves around the parking lot, sitting perfectly still, watching the darkness beyond the reach of our security lights. Rule number 7, trust the dogs. If stray dogs gather in the parking lot and refuse to leave, something dangerous is coming. I checked the time, 12:43 a.m. The coffee maker gurgled behind me, filling the lobby with the smell of burnt grounds and artificial vanilla. I pulled David's notebook from the drawer and flipped to his notes about the dogs. Dogs appeared on the night the thing that looked like Mrs. Henderson's grandson tried to check in. Grandson died in a car accident 3 years ago, but this thing had his driver's license, his voice, even the scar on his chin from falling off his bike when he was 8. Dogs wouldn't let it pass the parking lot, circled it until dawn, when it finally gave up and walked back into the desert. One of the dogs outside lifted its head, ears pricked toward the highway. A few seconds later, I heard the engine. Low rumble of something big moving fast. Headlights swept across the lobby windows as a black pickup truck pulled into the lot. The driver sat behind the wheel for a long moment before getting out. He moved like someone much older than he appeared, careful and deliberate, but his face looked maybe 25. Jeans, work boots, flannel shirt that had seen better days. Normal except for the way he kept glancing at the dogs and the way they responded. Hackles raised, lips pulled back to show their teeth. He pushed through the office door, and I caught his scent immediately. Wet earth and something metallic, like old pennies left in the rain. "Need a room," he said. His voice was his own, not layered like the woman in the floral dress, but it carried an echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a canyon. "How many nights?" "Just tonight." He pulled out a wallet that looked new, leather still stiff from the store. "Whatever you got available." I checked the registration book. Most rooms were empty, but something made me hesitate. Room 7's available. Nice and quiet. His smile showed too many teeth. Not extra teeth, just the wrong proportions, like someone had resized a normal mouth without adjusting the contents. Room 7 sounds perfect. Rule number 2, if someone requests room 7, give them room 19 instead. Tell them the water pressure is better. Do not explain further. But he hadn't requested room 7. He'd accepted my suggestion. Did the rule still apply? Outside, one of the dogs howled, a sound that raised every hair on my arms. The other 2 joined in, their voices weaving together into something that sounded almost like words. The man's smile faded. Those dogs seem upset about something. "They're just strays," I said, my hand hovering over the keys. Room 7 hung from its hook, brass worn smooth from handling. Room 19 hung right beside it. "Actually, you know what? Room 19 has better water pressure. You'll be more comfortable there." His eyes shifted to meet mine, and for a moment I forgot rule number 1. looking directly at him, was like staring into dark water. Something moved in the depths, something with its own agenda. My vision blurred at the edges, and I felt a tugging sensation behind my sternum, as if something were trying to pull my soul through my ribs. "Room 19 it is," he said, and the pressure released. I gasped, grabbing the edge of the desk for support. He signed the register as James Patterson, his handwriting neat and consistent throughout. I gave him the key and watched him walk to his truck, moving with that same careful gait. The dogs followed him with their eyes, but didn't approach. After he disappeared into room 19, I called my grandmother. "Shima," I said when she answered, using the Navajo word that meant both grandmother and the safe harbor she'd always been. "I need to ask you something about the old stories." "It's past midnight, grandson. Are you safe?" "I think so. But I need to know about things that borrow faces, things that aren't what they seem." She was quiet for a long moment. "Where are you asking this from?" "The motel, on 264 inches. Another pause, longer this time. "That place sits on old ground, Jake. Crossroads ground. Some of our people used to leave offerings there, back when it was just empty desert. Gifts for travelers who weren't entirely human." "What kind of travelers?" "The kind that wear skins that don't belong to them. The kind that remember things they never experienced. They need places to rest, Jake. Safe places where they won't be hunted. Your grandfather's generation understood this. They made agreements. The pieces started falling into place. The motel wasn't just a way station for supernatural creatures. It was a sanctuary, a neutral ground where things that couldn't exist in the daylight world could find temporary shelter." "The rules," I said. "They're not just about staying safe. They're about honoring an old treaty. Keep yourself protected, grandson. Sage and cedar, prayers your great-grandmother taught you. But remember, some agreements are older than our current understanding. Some promises must be kept, even when we don't remember making them." She hung up, leaving me alone with the humming vending machine and the knowledge that I wasn't just a night clerk. I was a guardian, standing watch over a boundary between worlds. Outside, the dogs had settled into a loose circle around room 19. They would stay there until dawn, making sure James Patterson, or whatever wore his face, kept to his side of the bargain. I opened David's notebook to a fresh page and began writing about the dogs, about my grandmother's words, about the weight of inherited obligations. Outside my window, the desert stretched away into darkness, full of travelers who would never see the sun. The man who called himself James Patterson checked out at dawn, sliding his key through the slot just like the woman in the floral dress. But this time, I was watching. I saw him load his black pickup truck with something heavy wrapped in a tarp, something that left dark stains on the truck bed. The dogs followed him to the highway's edge, then turned back toward the desert as his taillights disappeared into the morning haze. I should have felt relieved, but David's notebook contained 47 pages of rules, and I'd only experienced 2 encounters. 45 more scenarios waited in those carefully written margins, each one stranger than the last. The next 3 nights passed quietly. A family from Phoenix stopped for one night on their way to Monument Valley. 2 salesmen shared rooms 14 and 15, complaining about their company's new territory assignments. A young woman traveling alone took room 6, paid cash, and left before I could offer her a receipt. Normal people living normal lives, unaware they were sleeping in a way station for things that shouldn't exist. But on the 4th night, I learned about the children. It started with giggling around 12:30 a.m., high-pitched laughter drifting across the parking lot. At first, I thought it might be late-night television from one of the occupied rooms. But the sound was too clear, too present. It came from outside. Rule number 5. If you hear children laughing in the parking lot after midnight, do not investigate. There are no children staying at the motel. I pulled David's notebook from the drawer and found his notes about this particular rule. His handwriting grew smaller and more frantic as the entries progressed. First time hearing the children was 6 months into the job. Couldn't help myself. Went outside to check. Found 3 kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, playing some kind of tag game between the cars. They looked normal, except their clothes were too old-fashioned, like something from the 1940s. When I called out to them, they stopped playing and turned to look at me. All 3 had the same face. All 3 were smiling. Next entry, asked Mr. Forrester about the children. He went pale and told me never to acknowledge them, never to make contact. They're not children, he said. They're bait. Third entry, researched missing children in the area. Found newspaper articles dating back to 1943. 3 children, Maria Santos, Bobby Charlie, and Ruth Bamali, disappeared during a family camping trip near here. Bodies never found. The description matches what I saw exactly. The laughter grew louder, joined by the sound of bare feet running across asphalt. I forced myself to stay seated, eyes fixed on the computer screen, but every instinct screamed at me to look outside. The sounds moved closer to the office windows, and I heard small hands pressing against the glass. "Mister," a child's voice called out, sweet and innocent. "Mister, we lost our mommy." My hands clenched into fists. The voice belonged to a little girl, maybe 7 years old, scared and alone. Every protective instinct I'd inherited from generations of men who'd raised their families in a harsh country demanded that I help her. "She's in the desert," another voice added, this one belonging to a boy. "We can show you where. She's hurt." The third voice was softer, almost a whisper. "She's calling for help, but only we can hear her." I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to anchor myself to David's warnings. These weren't children. They were something else wearing children's shapes, using the one thing guaranteed to make any decent person abandon caution. The sounds continued for 20 minutes. Footsteps circling the building, hands tapping on windows, voices calling out increasingly desperate pleas for help. At one point, I heard what sounded like crying, soft sobs that made my chest ache with the need to comfort whoever was making them. Then, at exactly 1 a.m., the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before looking outside. The parking lot was empty except for a Toyota Camry belonging to the insurance adjuster in room 11. No children, no evidence they'd ever been there. But the windows bore small handprints in the dust, and when I checked the next morning, those prints remained even after the desert wind had scoured away every other mark. I added an entry to David's notebook. Night 7. The children came, followed the rules. They left after 1 hour. Handprints remain on east-facing windows. 2 nights later, I learned about room 23. The guest arrived at 2:15 a.m. in a sedan, so old I couldn't identify the make. The paint had faded to a color between brown and green, and the engine knocked like a dying heart. He emerged slowly, an elderly Navajo man wearing the traditional shirt and jeans that had been carefully mended multiple times. Silver hair hung in a loose braid down his back, and turquoise jewelry caught the lobby's fluorescent light. He moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd earned every year of his age, but something about his presence made the air feel thicker, charged with potential energy. "I need room 23, he said when he entered the office. His voice carried the accent of someone whose first language wasn't English, but his words were precisely chosen. "Only room 23. Rule number 6. Room 23 stays empty. If someone insists on that room specifically, call Mr. Forrester immediately. He will handle it." "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my tone respectful. "Room 23 isn't available." "I can see the key hanging behind you, grandson." His eyes were the color of desert sage, pale green with flecks of silver. "I can smell that no one has stayed in that room for many seasons. I need to make a phone call first." "Of course you do." He settled into one of the lobby chairs with the patience of someone who'd waited for much longer things than a nervous night clerk's phone call. "I'll be here." I dialed Forrester's number, my hands shaking slightly. The phone rang 6 times before his groggy voice answered. "This better be an emergency, Jake. Someone wants room 23. Specifically room 23. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, "Describe him." Elderly Navajo man, silver hair, traditional jewelry, driving an old sedan. He knew the room was empty. "Jesus." Forrester's voice was suddenly wide awake. "Okay, listen carefully. Give him the room. Don't charge him. Don't ask for identification. Write Thomas Begay in the register. He'll know the name. And Jake, whatever you hear from that room tonight, whatever sounds come from there, do not investigate. Do not call the police. Do not even think about opening that door." "What's in room 23? "It's not what's in the room. It's what the room connects to. Just follow my instructions and everything will be fine." The old man was still sitting patiently when I hung up. He accepted the key to room 23 without surprise, signed the register as Thomas Begay in handwriting that seemed to shift between English letters and symbols I didn't recognize. "You're Jake Begay," he said, not asking. "Wilson Begay's grandson." "You knew my grandfather?" "I knew your great-grandfather and his grandfather before him. Your family has been watching the crossroads for a long time, Jake. Longer than this motel has existed." He headed toward the door, then paused. "Tonight you might hear singing. Old songs in the old language. Don't be afraid. Some ceremonies take place between worlds, and this is one of those nights." Room 23 was around the back corner of the building, partially hidden by a utility shed and an old water tank. I'd never paid much attention to it before. The door was painted the same faded blue as all the others, the windows covered by curtains that never moved. But after Thomas Begay entered and closed the door behind him, I noticed details that shouldn't have been possible. The room had no air conditioning unit, though every other room at the motel had one mounted beneath its window. The electrical meter for that section of the building showed no current draw, even though light leaked around the edges of the curtains, and the shadow cast by the room was wrong. Too long, pointing in a direction that didn't match the angle of the security lights. At 3:17 a.m., the singing started. It began as a low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing. Then voices joined in, one by one, creating harmonies that seemed to come from deep underground. The language was Navajo, but older somehow, words that predated the reservation system and the long walk, and the first contact with European settlers. These were the voices of people who'd walked this desert when it was young, when the balance between worlds was maintained by ceremony rather than written rules. I found myself standing at the office window, drawn by music that spoke to something deeper than consciousness. The songs told stories of travelers who moved between realms, of guardians who kept the crossroads safe, of families who'd accepted the responsibility of watching over boundaries that most people never knew existed. The singing continued until dawn, when the first light turned the eastern sky the color of turquoise. Then the voices faded, one by one, until only the desert wind remained. Thomas Begay emerged from room 23 at exactly sunrise. He moved with the same careful dignity as the night before, but now he carried a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. He placed the room key on the office counter and nodded to me once before getting in his ancient sedan and driving away. When I checked room 23 an hour later, it was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that suggested it had never been used. The bed was made with sheets that still held creases from the package. The bathroom contained towels that had never been touched. Even the dust was wrong, too evenly distributed, as if the room had been reset to some baseline state. But on the dresser, someone had left a small bundle of sage and cedar, tied with red string. The scent filled the room with something that felt like protection, like blessing, like the continuation of agreements made in a time when words carried the weight of sacred obligation. I added Thomas Begay's visit to David's notebook, but some experiences resist documentation. Some mysteries are meant to be witnessed, not understood. 3 weeks passed without incident after Thomas Begay's visit. I settled into a rhythm, arrive at 11 p.m., burn sage behind the desk, study David's notebook during quiet hours, and document each night's events in careful detail. The rules became second nature, muscle memory that kept me alive when rational thought might have failed. But I was getting cocky. That's what my grandmother would have said if she'd seen me that Tuesday night in October, when I thought I understood the pattern well enough to predict what came next. The guest arrived at 1:43 a.m. in a pristine white sedan with government plates. Clean-shaven, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. Everything about him screamed federal agent, except for one detail. When he signed the register, his pen never touched the paper, but ink still appeared in neat block letters. "Agent Morrison, FBI," he said, flashing a badge that looked authentic except for the way it seemed to shimmer when I wasn't looking directly at it. "I'm investigating the disappearance of David Yazzie. I understand you're his replacement." This wasn't covered in David's notebook. I'd memorized every rule, every observation, every warning he'd left behind. But nowhere had he mentioned visits from federal agents, real or otherwise. "I never met David," I said carefully. "I just worked the night shift." "Of course." Morrison's smile was perfectly calibrated, the kind politicians practiced in mirrors. "But you must have found his notes, his records." David was very thorough about documenting irregularities. He knew about the notebook. Somehow, this thing wearing an FBI agent's face knew about David's carefully maintained record of supernatural encounters. That knowledge felt like a violation, as if something had reached into my private thoughts and stolen what wasn't meant to be shared. "I don't know what you're talking about." Morrison leaned against the counter, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Expensive, but underneath it, something else. Something that reminded me of meat left too long in a warm car. Jake Begay, age 23, graduated from Diné College with a degree in criminal justice. Your grandmother is Elena Begay, well respected in the community, known for her traditional knowledge. Your cousin Tommy recommended you for this position after David's disappearance. The recitation of personal details was meant to intimidate, to show how much he knew about my life. But there were gaps in his information, details only someone who'd actually investigated would have included. No mention of my internship with tribal law enforcement, my student loans, the reason I'd moved back to Window Rock. He was working from a template, not real research. "A lot of people know those things," I said. "True." Morrison straightened his tie with fingers that moved too smoothly, as if his joints bent in directions they shouldn't. "But not everyone knows about your family's historical connection to this location." 3 generations of Begays have worked jobs related to this stretch of highway. Your great-grandfather was a trading post operator. Your grandfather ran a gas station. Now you're here, continuing the tradition. That information wasn't in any official record. It was family history, passed down through stories told around kitchen tables and campfires. The kind of knowledge that died when elders passed away, unless someone had been listening very carefully for a very long time. What do you want? Cooperation. Morrison pulled out a business card that felt wrong in my hand. Too heavy, too warm, like it was made from something other than paper. David's notebook. His observations. Anything that might help us understand what happened to him. I thought about David walking into the desert, following something that looked like his dead brother. About the rules he'd broken and the price he'd paid for breaking them. About the delicate balance this place maintained between worlds that shouldn't touch. I don't have anything like that. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. For just a moment, I saw deeper layers, older intentions, hungrier needs. This thing had been trying to find David's notebook for a long time, and my refusal to cooperate had triggered something closer to its true nature. Perhaps I should speak with your grandmother. Elena Begay has quite a reputation for traditional healing. I imagine she knows many interesting stories about this area. The threat was subtle, but clear. Cooperate, or he'd involve my grandmother in whatever game he was playing. But the mention of her healing practice was another mistake. My grandmother wasn't known for traditional healing. She was a retired teacher who raised sheep and grew the best tomatoes in Window Rock. Whoever had briefed Morrison had confused her with someone else, possibly Elena Yazzie, who lived 3 miles east and actually practiced traditional medicine. She's just a retired teacher, I said. Is she? Morrison's head tilted at an angle that looked comfortable, until you realized no human neck bent quite that way. I think you're being modest about your family's capabilities. That's when I remembered rule number 8. Never serve coffee to guests who don't cast reflections in the pot's surface. I hadn't offered Morrison coffee, but the pot sat on its warming plate behind me, its polished steel surface acting like a mirror. When I glanced at it, I saw my own reflection clearly. Tired face, rumpled shirt, the worry lines that had appeared since I'd started this job. But the space where Morrison stood reflected only empty air. My mouth went dry. Whatever was wearing Agent Morrison's appearance wasn't substantial enough to cast a reflection, which meant it probably wasn't substantial enough to be bound by the normal rules that kept the other supernatural guests contained to their assigned rooms. You know what? I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. Let me get you that coffee. Long drive from Albuquerque, I bet. That's very kind. Morrison's smile widened, showing teeth that were the right color but the wrong shape, as if someone had carved them from ivory without understanding how human dentition actually worked. Black, no sugar. I turned toward the coffee station, using the movement to pull David's notebook from its drawer. Flipping to the back pages, I found what I was looking for. Rule 23, Emergency Protocols. If something threatens to expose or disrupt the neutral ground status, invoke the protection of the Crossroads Guardians. Burn cedar and sage together, speak the old words, and trust that the arrangements made by previous generations will hold. The problem was, I didn't know the old words. My grandmother had tried to teach me traditional prayers when I was younger, but I'd been more interested in video games and basketball. Now that lack of cultural education might get me killed. I made Morrison's coffee with hands that barely shook, then set the cup on the counter between us. He reached for it, and I noticed his fingers cast shadows that moved independently of his hand. Excellent service, he said, taking a sip, though the taste is a bit earthier than I expected. I dumped half the remaining sage into the coffee grounds before brewing. If he could taste it, that meant whatever he was could be affected by traditional protections. Local water, I explained. Mineral content is pretty high. Morrison finished the coffee in 3 quick swallows, then set the empty cup down with fingers that left frost marks on its surface. About that notebook. The office door chimed, and another guest entered. This one was clearly human. A woman in her 40s wearing scrubs and a tired expression that said she'd just finished a double shift at some hospital. She nodded to both of us and approached the counter. "Need a room for the night," she said. "Something quiet. I've been driving for 6 hours." Morrison turned to look at her, and I saw his face flicker like a television changing channels. For just a moment, his features rearranged themselves into something with too many angles and not enough skin, before snapping back to the federal agent persona. "Ma'am?" he said politely. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. I'm conducting interviews related to an ongoing investigation. I'll need to speak with you briefly before you check in." The woman's tired expression shifted to confusion. "About what? I'm just passing through." "Standard procedure, won't take long." But I remembered another rule from David's notebook, one written in red ink and underlined 3 times. Never let them question the innocent. If something tries to interrogate regular guests, it's hunting for information about witnesses. Prevent contact at all costs. "Actually," I said loudly, "room 14 is ready right now. Best view of the sunrise, and it's right next to the ice machine." I handed the woman a key and gestured toward the hallway that led to the guest rooms. She took it gratefully and headed for the door, but Morrison moved to intercept her. "Ma'am, I really do need just a moment." The sage I'd burned earlier suddenly flared brighter, sending up a thick cloud of smoke that filled the lobby. Morrison stepped back, coughing, and I saw his outline blur and shift in the haze. When the smoke cleared, the woman was gone and Morrison's suit was wrinkled, as if the fabric was having trouble maintaining its shape. "Faulty ventilation system," I said. "Old building." Morrison straightened his jacket with movements that looked rehearsed, learned from watching human behavior rather than lived experience. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation outside. Fresh air might be better for both of us. I need to stay at the desk. Company policy." "Of course." His smile was starting to look painted on, a fixed expression that didn't match the calculation in his eyes. "Well then, I suppose I'll need to make other arrangements." He headed for the door, moving with that same careful gait I'd noticed in other supernatural guests. But as he reached for the handle, he paused. "Jake, word of advice. Some people get very attached to family traditions, even when those traditions have outlived their usefulness. Don't let nostalgia make you careless." The door chimed as he left, but I didn't see him getting to the white sedan. When I looked outside 10 minutes later, the parking lot was empty except for the woman's Honda and the distant glow of taillights disappearing toward the highway. I added Morrison's visit to David's notebook, but some encounters resist documentation. Some threats come dressed as help, and the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly what you're protecting. The night Morrison visited, 3 more vehicles pulled into the parking lot before dawn. I should have known something was wrong when they all arrived within minutes of each other, like they'd been waiting for the fake agent to leave before making their approach. The first was a rusted pickup truck that wheezed and rattled as it parked near room 3. The second, a motorcycle that purred too quietly for its size, took a spot by the ice machine. The third made no sound at all, a sedan that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a dark space in the parking lot that hurt to look at directly. I consulted David's notebook frantically, searching for rules about multiple arrivals, but found only scattered observations about busy nights. Most supernatural guests traveled alone, preferring solitude to the complications that came with witnesses. 3 arrivals in one night suggested something larger was happening. Some event or circumstance that had driven them all to seek shelter at the same time. The pickup truck's driver entered first. She looked like any ranch woman from the area. Weathered face, calloused hands, boots that had seen decades of honest work. But she moved too carefully, placing each foot like she was testing whether the ground would hold her weight. "Need a room," she said. Her voice carried the flat accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Navajo first, English second. Preferably something on the ground floor, away from the highway noise. I checked the register. Rooms 8, 12, and 16 were available on the ground floor. Room 12 has a nice view of the desert, I offered. "That'll work." She signed the register as Maria Antone, her handwriting steady and familiar. Too familiar. When I compared it to previous entries, I realized she'd used the exact same signature as the Maria Antone, who'd stayed here 6 months ago, according to David's records. Same loops, same pressure, same tiny flourish on the final E. Either this was the same woman returning, or something had copied her signature with photographic precision. Before I could process this fully, the motorcycle rider entered. Tall, lean, wearing leathers that looked expensive enough to buy a decent used car. His helmet hung from his arm, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the predatory alertness in his eyes. "Room for the night," he said. No accent, no regional markers in his speech. He could have been from anywhere or nowhere. Something secure. I travel with valuable cargo. What kind of cargo? The question slipped out before I could stop it. His smile revealed perfect teeth, too perfect, like a dental advertisement. The kind that's better left undisturbed. I gave him room 8, 2 doors down from Maria Antone. He signed as Michael Rivera, and his handwriting matched David's notes about a Michael Rivera who'd stayed here repeatedly over the past year. Same guest, or same copying technique. The third visitor took longer to approach the office. Through the window, I watched the dark sedan sit in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes before its door finally opened. What emerged wasn't quite a person, more like the suggestion of one. A shape that resembled humanity without committing to the details. When it entered the lobby, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. The fluorescent light above the door began strobing, casting rapid shadows that made it hard to focus on the figure's face. What I could see shifted constantly. Now an elderly man, now a young woman, now something that might have been either or neither. "I require accommodation," it said, and its voice was like wind through empty buildings. "The compact between your kind and mine guarantees sanctuary." This was beyond anything in David's notebook. I flipped to the section on emergency protocols, hands shaking as I searched for guidance about entities that claimed treaty rights. What names should I put in the register? I am known by many names. Use whichever brings you comfort. The evasion triggered a memory of my grandmother's stories about beings that couldn't or wouldn't speak their true names, entities whose power was tied to the words others used to define them. To name something was to give it substance. And this creature seemed to exist in the spaces between definitions. I wrote guest in the register, and it signed beneath with a symbol that hurt to look at. Not because it was frightening, but because my eyes couldn't quite process its angles and curves. The symbol seemed to writhe on the page, rearranging itself each time I glanced away and back. "Room 19, I said, handing over the key. "Acceptable." The figure accepted the key with fingers that passed through the metal before solidifying enough to grip it. I trust the other travelers will respect the boundaries of sanctuary. That phrase, other travelers, suggested these 3 arrivals weren't coincidental. They were connected somehow, part of the same event or crisis that had driven them all to seek shelter at the Desert Rose. After the 3rd guest disappeared into room 19, I called Mr. Forrester. The phone rang 8 times before going to voicemail. I tried his cell phone, then his home number. No answer anywhere. The office felt smaller, with 3 supernatural guests occupying rooms within 100 yards of the front desk. I burned extra sage, checked the locks on the office door twice, and positioned David's notebook where I could reference it quickly. Every few minutes, I glanced outside to make sure all 3 vehicles remained where they'd been parked. At 3:22 a.m., something went wrong with room 16. The guest there was perfectly human, a traveling salesman named Robert Chen who checked in around 11 p.m. with business cards and a tired smile. He'd taken his key without incident, complained mildly about the Wi-Fi password, and disappeared into his room to make phone calls to clients on the East Coast. But at 3:22, I heard him screaming. Not the startled yell of someone who'd seen a spider or stubbed their toe. This was the sound of someone in genuine terror, the kind of fear that reaches straight through civilized behavior to touch something primal and desperate. Rule number 15. If you hear screaming from an occupied room, call the authorities immediately. The police handle human emergencies, but verify that the guest is actually human before involving outside agencies. The screaming continued, rising and falling in waves that suggested someone was trying to call for help, between bouts of panic. I grabbed the office phone and started dialing 911, then stopped. How could I verify that Robert Chen was actually human without leaving the office? And what if he wasn't? What if something had replaced him between check-in and now? The screaming stopped abruptly. I stood frozen behind the desk, phone in hand, waiting for some sign of what had happened. Through the window, I could see the lights still burning in room 16, but no shadows moved against the curtains. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the office. Slow, measured steps that suggested someone walking with purpose rather than panic. The footsteps approached the office door and stopped. A knock came, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the lobby. "Hello?" Robert Chen's voice called out. "I think there's been some kind of mistake with my room." I looked through the office window but couldn't see anyone standing outside the door. The voice was coming from the right location, but there was no corresponding figure visible. "What kind of mistake?" I called back. "The room seems to be occupied. There's someone in there, but they won't respond when I knock on the bathroom door. I think they might be hurt." That made no sense. Robert Chen had been alone when he checked in, and I hadn't assigned room 16 to anyone else. The only way someone else could be in that room was if they'd entered without using the door, through a window or by other means. "Are you injured, Mr. Chen?" "No, I'm fine. Just confused." "Could you come take a look?" Rule number 9. Never leave the office between midnight and dawn unless facing immediate physical danger. The neutral ground protections are strongest near the front desk, but rule number 15 said to assist guests with emergencies. The rules were contradicting each other, and David's notebook offered no guidance about which took precedence. "I'll call the police," I said. "They can sort out what's happening." "Please don't." Chem's voice carried a note of urgency that seemed genuine. "I travel a lot for work, and police reports create complications with my company. If you could just take a quick look, maybe we can handle this ourselves." I thought about the 3 supernatural guests in their rooms, about Morrison's threat earlier that evening, about the delicate balance that kept this place functioning as neutral ground. Involving the police might disrupt whatever arrangement protected the motel, but leaving the office could put me in danger. The footsteps moved away from the door, heading back toward the guest rooms. Through the window, I watched Robert Chen's figure walk across the parking lot. Visible now, but moving strangely. Too fluid, like someone walking underwater. I grabbed the office phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Jake Begay at the Desert Rose Motel on Highway 264. I have a guest who's reporting an intruder in his room, but something seems wrong with the situation. Are you in immediate danger? I don't think so. I'm locked in the office. We'll have a unit out there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like forever, but it was better than venturing into the parking lot alone. I settled back behind the desk and watched the guest rooms through the window, looking for any sign of movement or trouble. At 3:41 a.m., the light in room 16 went out. At 3:43, Robert Chen's Toyota Camry started up and pulled out of the parking lot, heading east toward Window Rock. At 3:45, Maria Amtone emerged from room 12, loaded something bulky into her pickup truck, and drove away without returning her key. At 3:47, Michael Rivera's motorcycle roared to life and disappeared into the night. At 3:49, the dark sedan simply wasn't there anymore. No engine sound, no movement. One moment it occupied a parking space, the next moment the space was empty. When the police arrived 30 minutes later, they found room 16 unlocked and empty. The bed had been slept in. The bathroom showed signs of use, but there was no Robert Chen and no evidence of any disturbance. The registration book showed his signature, but when the officer asked to see his license plate number, I realized I'd never actually written it down. False alarm, I told Officer Martinez, a patient woman who'd probably dealt with worse calls during her career. Guest must have resolved whatever the problem was. She made a note in her report and advised me to call immediately if anything else unusual happened. After she left, I added the night's events to David's notebook, but some experiences resist documentation. Some nights reveal that the rules you've memorized aren't comprehensive enough to cover every situation that might arise. I spent the remaining hours until dawn, wondering if Robert Chen had ever existed at all, or if something else had used his appearance to test the boundaries of sanctuary. The registration book still showed his signature, but signatures could be faked, memories could be implanted, and the screaming I'd heard might have been a recording, designed to draw me away from the safety of the office. By sunrise, I understood that my education in the rules of supernatural hospitality was far from complete. The morning after the Robert Chen incident, I found my grandmother waiting in the motel parking lot when I finished my shift. She sat in her old Ford pickup, engine running, wearing the serious expression she reserved for conversations about responsibility and consequence. "Get in," she said when I approached her window. "We need to talk." I climbed into the passenger seat, noting the bundle of sage and cedar on the dashboard, the small medicine pouch hanging from the rearview mirror. My grandmother didn't usually travel with ceremonial items unless she was visiting someone who needed healing or protection. "You called the police last night," she said as we drove toward Window Rock. Not a question. "How did you know?" "Evelyn Martinez is my second cousin." She told me about the call to the Desert Rose, about a guest who disappeared between the time you reported trouble and when she arrived. My grandmother's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "Jake, there are protocols for dealing with these situations. Calling outside authorities isn't one of them. The rules contradicted each other. I had to make a choice. The rules David left you are incomplete." She pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that led to a small rise overlooking the valley. They cover the basic situations, the routine encounters, but they don't explain the deeper obligations, the older agreements. We parked beneath a cluster of juniper trees, their twisted branches providing shade from the morning sun. My grandmother reached behind the seat and pulled out a weathered book, its cover made from leather so old it had turned nearly black. This belonged to your great-great-grandfather, Joseph B. Gay. He was the first of our family to work the crossroads, back when it was just a trading post and a water well. The entities that visit your motel have been traveling this route for longer than the highways existed, longer than the Spanish came north, longer than anyone can remember. She opened the book to pages covered in handwriting that switched between English, Navajo, and symbols I didn't recognize. The entries dated back to 1889, documenting encounters with travelers who weren't entirely human. Joseph made the first agreement, she continued, safe passage in exchange for sanctuary. No hunting of humans in this territory, no feeding on the local population, no interference with the natural world beyond what was necessary for their survival. In return, we provide a place where they can rest during their journeys between realms. I studied the entries, noting similarities to David's observations, but also crucial differences. Joseph's notes contained details about specific entities, their origins, their destinations. He'd recorded names and relationships, mapped out a complex ecosystem of supernatural travelers. David's notebook only covers the surface rules, my grandmother said, the ones designed to keep a night clerk safe. But you're not just a night clerk, Jake. You're the current guardian of a treaty that's kept this region stable for over a century. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? Because we hoped you wouldn't need to know. David was supposed to train you gradually, introduce you to the deeper responsibilities over time. But David chose to walk into the desert rather than face what was coming. What was coming? My grandmother pointed to an entry near the end of Joseph's book. The handwriting was shakier here, as if written during stress or illness. The date was October 15th, 1924. The arrangement is changing. Some of the older entities are growing restless, questioning why they should honor agreements made with people who no longer understand their true nature. They speak of ending the compact, of returning to the old ways when they took what they needed without permission. The young ones listen to these arguments. I fear what might happen if the balance is disrupted. Every few generations, the agreement needs to be renewed, my grandmother explained. The entities who made the original compact eventually move on or fade away, and new ones take their place. These new travelers don't always accept the terms their predecessors agreed to. The 3 guests last night. We're testing you. Seeing if the current guardian understood the protocols, if the motel was still protected by someone who knew the old ways. She turned to another page in Joseph's book. Your great-great-grandfather faced a similar test in 1924. 3 entities arrived on the same night, each one pushing the boundaries of the agreement in different ways. One questioned the sanctuary rules, one tested the non-interference clause, and one challenged the guardian's authority directly. What happened to the guest who said he was Robert Chen? Probably never existed. The entities can create false memories, fabricate entire identities to test how you respond to unusual situations. They wanted to see if you'd abandon your post, if you'd involve outside authorities, if you understood that some problems can't be solved by conventional means. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Everything I thought I knew about the night shift, about my role at the motel, had been preparation for something larger. I wasn't just following David's rules. I was maintaining a supernatural peace treaty that protected thousands of people across the Southwest. What happens if I fail the test? The compact ends. The entities return to taking what they need from human populations instead of accepting our hospitality. People start disappearing again, not just individuals, but entire families, whole communities. The Navajo Nation has oral histories about what this region was like before the first agreement was made. We don't want to return to those times. She drove me back to my apartment in Window Rock, but before I got out of the truck, she handed me Joseph's book. Study this tonight. Tomorrow evening, when you return to work, you'll face the real test. The entities will send someone with full authority to renegotiate or terminate the compact. Everything depends on how well you understand our obligations and their expectations. I spent that day reading Joseph's book cover to cover, trying to absorb over a century of accumulated wisdom about supernatural diplomacy. The entries revealed a complex relationship between human guardians and entities that existed between worlds, creatures that needed rest, stops during long journeys across dimensions or time. Some were benevolent, grateful for sanctuary, and careful to follow the established rules. Others were predatory, constantly testing the boundaries of what they could take without violating the agreement. A few seemed genuinely alien, operating according to logic that Joseph could observe, but never fully understand. But throughout all the entries, one principle remained constant. The Guardian's word was binding. Whatever agreements I made on behalf of the Desert Rose Motel would affect not just me, but my family, my community, and generations of future travelers. When I returned to work that evening, Mr. Forrester was waiting in the lobby. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since our last conversation, his normally nervous demeanor replaced by something closer to defeat. "Jake," he said, "I need to tell you something about this place, about what your family signed up for when they agreed to provide guardians. I know about the compact. My grandmother explained everything." Relief flooded his face. "Good. That saves time we don't have." He gestured toward the registration book. "Look at tonight's reservations." The book showed 3 entries, all written in different handwriting, but with the same precise toning. Arrival at 11:30 p.m. The names were significant: Thomas Begay, Maria Antone, and Agent Morrison. The same entities from previous encounters, but this time, they were coming together, openly. "They're here to renegotiate," Forrester said. "The original compact expires tonight, and they want to discuss new terms. These aren't random travelers anymore, Jake. They're representatives with the authority to make binding decisions for their respective communities." "What kind of new terms?" "I don't know. But judging from the preliminary encounters over the past few weeks, they're not entirely satisfied with the current arrangement. The woman who claims to be Maria Antone represents the shapeshifters, the ones who borrow human appearances for extended periods. Morrison speaks for the entities that feed on information and memory. And Thomas Begay." Forrester paused. "He's not just any ceremonial singer. He's the voice of this land itself, the spirit of the crossroads that existed here before humans arrived." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. In a few hours, I would be negotiating on behalf of every human who lived within hundreds of miles of this location, trying to maintain a balance that had kept the peace for over a century. What if I make the wrong decision? "Then people die," Forrester said simply. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. The entities will return to their old feeding patterns, and we'll be powerless to stop them." He left me alone with Joseph's book and the growing understanding that my education in the night shift had been preparation for this moment. Every rule I'd learned, every encounter I'd survived, had been building toward a single conversation that would determine the future of supernatural relations in the Southwest. At 11:25 p.m., 3 vehicles pulled into the parking lot in perfect synchronization. I lit extra sage, checked that my great-great-grandfather's book was within easy reach, and prepared to discover whether 4 months of night shifts had taught me enough to speak for the living and the dead. They entered together at exactly 11:30 p.m. moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd planned this encounter for decades. Thomas Begay led the group, wearing the same traditional shirt and turquoise jewelry I remembered from his visit to room 23. Behind him came Maria Antone, her ranchwoman appearance somehow more solid and defined than during her previous stay. Agent Morrison brought up the rear, his federal agent costume perfect, down to the precisely knotted tie and polished shoes. But tonight, none of them bothered with the pretense of being human travelers seeking accommodation. Their true natures showed through the careful disguises like light through thin fabric. Thomas Begay's eyes held the deep patience of stones that had watched centuries pass. Maria Antone's shadow moved independently of her body, and Morrison's reflection showed nothing but empty space in the lobby's glass surfaces. "Jake Begay," Thomas said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in my chest. "Grandson of Wilson, great-grandson of Joseph. The time has come to speak of old promises and new necessities." They arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the front desk, and I realized this wasn't just a business meeting. It was a formal council, conducted according to protocols that predated written law. I pulled Joseph's book from its drawer and placed it on the counter between us, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of handling. "I'm here to listen," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "The compact your ancestor negotiated has served both our peoples well," Thomas continued. "For over a century, we have honored the boundaries established at this crossroads. Safe passage in exchange for sanctuary. No hunting of humans in this territory. No interference beyond necessity. But circumstances change, and agreements must evolve or perish." Maria Antone stepped forward, her borrowed appearance rippling like water disturbed by wind. "The world has grown smaller since Joseph's time. Humans multiply and spread across lands that once belonged to wilder things. The spaces between your cities shrink each year, leaving fewer places where our kind can travel unseen. We require expanded territory," Morrison added, his voice carrying that multi-layered quality I remembered from our first encounter. "Access to urban areas where information flows more freely. The current restrictions limit us to desert crossroads that grow less relevant with each passing decade." I opened Joseph's book to the section documenting the original negotiations, running my finger along text that detailed the careful balance my great-great-grandfather had established. The entities had agreed to limit their hunting grounds in exchange for guaranteed safe houses, but they were right about the changing world. What had worked in 1889 might not serve either side in 2024. "What specific changes are you proposing?" I asked. Thomas Begay gestured toward the parking lot, where Highway 264 stretched away into darkness. "Extend the sanctuary network. Establish way stations in Albuquerque, Phoenix, Denver. Places where our kind can rest during longer journeys through human-dominated landscapes." "In return," Maria said, "we would maintain the non-interference clause in rural areas. No hunting on reservation lands, no taking from small communities that can't sustain the losses." Morrison's smile revealed those two perfect teeth. "But urban areas would become fair game. Cities generate surplus population, excess information, resources that won't be missed if harvested carefully." The proposal was elegant and horrifying in equal measure. They were offering to protect rural communities like mine while gaining access to millions of urban humans who would become potential prey. It was the kind of compromise that might seem reasonable until you considered the individual lives that would be lost. "I need to understand what harvesting means in practical terms," I said. "Memories that won't be missed," Morrison explained. "Redundant experiences, duplicate records, information that serves no purpose except to clutter human consciousness. We would be performing a cleaning service." "And the shapeshifters?" I looked at Maria Antone, whose borrowed face showed no expression. temporary borrowing of unused identities, people who've withdrawn from society, hermits and recluses who wouldn't be missed for weeks or months. We would return their forms when our business concluded, largely unharmed. Largely, there would be some wear, memory gaps, shortened lifespans, nothing that would draw attention from authorities. I thought about Robert Chen, about the screaming I'd heard from room 16, about the possibility that someone real had been replaced by an entity testing my responses. The casual way Maria discussed wear on borrowed human forms made my stomach clench with revulsion. And Thomas. I turned to the oldest of the three representatives. What does the spirit of the crossroads gain from this arrangement? His ancient eyes met mine with something that might have been approval. Balance. The current compact protects a small region at the cost of growing pressure elsewhere. Like a dam that prevents flooding in one valley while the water builds higher and higher behind the barrier. Eventually, the dam breaks, and everything is destroyed. But if we expand the controlled zones, I said slowly, working through the implications, we prevent the catastrophic failure by managing the pressure systematically. Exactly. Thomas nodded. Sacrifice a few to save many. Allow controlled predation in sustainable amounts, rather than risk uncontrolled feeding when the current system collapses. The logic was sound from a purely practical standpoint, but it required accepting that some humans were more expendable than others. Urban dwellers versus rural communities. Isolated individuals versus people embedded in close-knit families. It was the kind of utilitarian calculation that felt reasonable until you imagined being the one sacrificed for the greater good. I need to consider the full implications, I said, buying time to think through the decision. Of course. Morrison's business card appeared in his hand, still too warm and too heavy. But consider carefully. The current compact expires at dawn. If no new agreement is reached, we return to the old ways. Uncontrolled hunting across all territories. How many would die if the compact ended entirely? Thomas Bigay's expression grew somber. In the first year? Hundreds, maybe thousands. The young ones have no experience with sustainable predation. They would take what they wanted without understanding the need for moderation. And how many would die under your proposed expansion? Dozens annually, but selected carefully to minimize impact on human society. A surgeon's cut rather than a wolf's bite. I opened Joseph's book to its final entries, searching for guidance my great-great-grandfather might have left for this exact situation. The pages revealed his growing understanding that the compact wasn't a permanent solution, but rather a delaying tactic that bought time for both sides to adapt to changing circumstances. The entities evolve, as do we. What seems like an eternal agreement is actually a series of temporary arrangements, each one renegotiated when the balance shifts. The Guardian's role is not to preserve the past, but to find new equilibrium points that serve both people's survival. I propose a compromise, I said, closing the book and looking each representative in the eye. Expand the sanctuary network, but with different terms. Establish way stations in cities, but restrict feeding to targets who've already chosen to disconnect from human society. Morrison can harvest memories from people with advanced dementia who've already lost their past. Maria can borrow forms from terminally ill patients who have days rather than years remaining. Thomas can claim territories that humans have abandoned, ghost towns, defunct military bases, areas we've already surrendered to decay. Morrison's perfect smile faltered. You're asking us to subsist on scraps. I'm asking you to maintain the principle that human life has value, even when it's inconvenient. I stood straighter, feeling the weight of generations behind my words. The original compact worked because it recognized that both sides had legitimate needs, Your proposal abandons that recognition in favor of convenience." Maria Antone's form rippled more violently, her borrowed appearance struggling to contain whatever lay beneath. "And if we reject your counterproposal, if we choose to end the compact rather than accept such limitations, then you'll be fighting not just me, but every medicine person, every traditionalist, every family that remembers the old stories about what happens when the balance is broken. You might win that war, but the cost would be higher than you're willing to pay." Thomas Begay studied me with those ancient eyes, and I felt him weighing my words against decades of accumulated wisdom. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud. You understand that strength comes not from refusing to compromise, but from knowing which principles cannot be abandoned." He turned to the other representatives. "The young guardian's terms are acceptable. We will take what is freely given or already lost, rather than what is simply convenient to claim." Morrison straightened his tie with movements that looked more human than they had minutes earlier. "Acceptable, with one modification. We require assurance that new guardians will be trained properly. David Yazzie disappearance left gaps in the knowledge transfer that nearly compromised everything." "Agreed," I said. "I'll document everything, train my replacement thoroughly when the time comes." "Then we have a new compact." Thomas Begay extended his hand, and when I shook it, I felt the weight of promises that would outlive me. Valid for 25 years, subject to renegotiation when circumstances require. They left as they had arrived, together, with purpose, disappearing into vehicles that carried them back to whatever spaces they inhabited between worlds. I added the night's events to both David's notebook and Joseph's book, documenting the new terms for whoever would inherit this responsibility after me. Dawn was breaking over the desert when I finally understood that the night shift had never been about following rules. It had always been about learning to make the decisions that rules couldn't cover. The new guest arrived on a Tuesday night when the desert wind carried the scent of rain that wouldn't come for another month. She looked exactly like any college student traveling home for winter break. Backpack stuffed with textbooks, tired eyes from too much studying, hands stained with ink from final exams. But her shadow fell in two directions at once, and when she signed the register, her pen left marks that glowed briefly before settling into ordinary blue ink. "Just one night," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, though I couldn't place the origin. "Room doesn't matter, as long as it's quiet." I handed her the key to room 14, watching as she examined it with the careful attention of someone checking for hidden meanings. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified by this encounter. Now, I simply made note of her arrival time and added her to the careful records I kept for the new compact. "Coffee's fresh if you want some," I offered. "Thank you." Her smile was genuine, grateful in the way that suggested she'd traveled a long distance to reach sanctuary. It's been a difficult journey. After she disappeared into her room, I pulled out the notebook that had replaced David's original journal. My handwriting filled page after page with observations about the new patterns of supernatural travel, the subtle changes in behavior since the compact's renegotiation. The entities who visited now were different, more cautious, more respectful of boundaries, more aware that their continued sanctuary depended on maintaining careful balance. The phone rang, interrupting my documentation. My grandmother's voice carried the warmth that had anchored me through the hardest nights of learning this responsibility. "How are things at the crossroads, grandson?" "Quiet tonight. One traveler, following all the protocols." "Good. I wanted you to know that Tommy's daughter is interested in learning about her family's history. She's been asking about the old stories, about the responsibilities that pass between generations." I smiled, understanding the subtext. 18-year-old Sarah Begay was curious about more than family stories. She was being prepared for the possibility of inheriting guardianship when my time ended. The knowledge that the responsibility would continue after me brought comfort I hadn't expected. "Tell her the stories are worth learning," I said. "All of them." "I will. Sleep well when your shift ends." After hanging up, I returned to my notebook, documenting not just the night's events, but the broader patterns I'd observed since the new compact took effect. The urban way stations were functioning exactly as negotiated, providing rest stops for entities who confined their feeding to targets that met the strict criteria we'd established. Morrison had kept his word about harvesting only memories from those who'd already lost them to disease. Maria Antone borrowed forms exclusively from hospice patients who volunteered their remaining time in exchange for stories about the spaces between worlds. Most importantly, the young entities were learning restraint. The catastrophic feeding frenzy that Thomas Begay had warned about never materialized, because the older generation took responsibility for teaching sustainable practices. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "New guardian in Albuquerque requests consultation about unexpected visitor. Can you help?" The message reminded me that my role had evolved beyond maintaining the Desert Rose. I'd become part of a network of guardians managing supernatural relations across the Southwest, each of us responsible for a different node in an expanding system of way stations and safe houses. I typed back, "Available after 7 a.m. "What kind of visitor?" Claims to be offering technological upgrades to existing compact. Has documentation that looks authentic, but feels wrong. The response made me sit up straighter. Technological upgrades suggested entities I hadn't encountered yet, possibly representing communities that had remained hidden during the renegotiation. The original compact had covered shapeshifters, memory feeders, and land spirits, but the supernatural world was larger and more complex than even Thomas Begay had revealed. "Do not engage alone," I texted back. "Wait for backup." Through the office window, I watched the student in room 14 emerge and walk to her car. She moved differently now, more confident, as if the few hours of sanctuary had restored something essential to her nature. Before driving away, she approached the office door and slipped an envelope through the mail slot. Inside, I found a brief note written in the same glowing ink she'd used to sign the register. "Thank you for maintaining the old courtesies. The young ones remember kindness." Attached to the note was a small bundle of herbs I didn't recognize, tied with silver thread. The scent was unlike anything in my grandmother's medicine collection. Sweet but sharp, familiar yet completely alien. I added the bundle to the growing collection of gifts left by grateful travelers. Tokens of appreciation that served as reminders of how many lives the compact touched. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when Mr. Forrester arrived for our weekly briefing. He looked healthier now, less burdened by responsibilities he'd carried alone for too long. The network of guardians meant that no single person bore the weight of maintaining supernatural peace across the entire region. "How was the night?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Routine. One traveler following protocols, but we might have a new situation developing in Albuquerque." "Technology related?" "Possibly." I handed him the printout of my text exchange with the Albuquerque Guardian. "It might be time to consult with Thomas Begay about expanding the compact again." Forrester nodded, making notes in his own journal. "The world keeps changing. Our agreements have to change with it." As my shift ended and the morning staff arrived, I realized that David Yazzie greatest mistake hadn't been following something into the desert. It had been believing that the rules he'd learned were complete, that the notebook he'd maintained contained everything needed to handle every situation. The truth was simpler and more challenging. Being a guardian meant learning to navigate uncertainty with wisdom, inherited from previous generations, and courage drawn from the knowledge that some responsibilities were worth the risk they demanded. I drove home as the sun painted the desert the color of hope, already planning how to explain to Sarah Begay that the night shift was about much more than following rules.